is the account of the 10 plagues of Egypt. God sent devastating plagues to free the Hebrews from slavery. But many source critics claim this was the work of a later redactor. Originally, the account was divided between E and P and maybe J, which listed different plagues that occurred. To remedy this, a redactor combined the accounts, thus creating the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt. However, there are numerous problems with this hypothesis. When we look at the data, it makes more sense the 10 plagues of Egypt was originally written as a unified narrative. The documentary hypothesis states the Pentateuch was originally 4 different sources. A redactor combined them, preserving as much material as possible. Allegedly, when this occurred, there were different accounts of the plagues in Egypt that were stitched together. The longer version belonged to the J or E source, and a shorter version with fewer plagues belonged to P. However, when we read the hypothesized sources, we run into problems. First, there is wide disagreement about how to divide the sources. If we focus on Exodus 7 momentarily, we see numerous scholars disagree on how to divide the text up. Some say it should be divided between 2 sources, whereas others say 3. When we look at the full plagues narrative, we see it as no settled matter on how to divide up the passage. Samuel Driver said the text should be divided up between 3 sources. Brevard Childs said tentatively it might even be 4 sources. Richard Elliott Friedman says it's only 2 sources, E and P, which leaves J highly fragmented. It goes from the Pharaoh asking who is the Lord that he should listen to him, and stating he won't let Israel go, to the Lord leading Israel out of Egypt as a pillar of fire. This is an unreasonable gap in the narrative, if most of J is supposed to be preserved in the Pentateuch. The P source also has gaps in the narrative. It is missing the 10th plague. It goes from the Lord announcing he will pass through the land and strike down the firstborn, to Israel leaving Egypt, with no account of the final plague or Pharaoh finally relenting. The plagues assigned to P conclude with the Pharaoh hardening his heart, except for the plague of frogs. It's missing a verse of the Pharaoh hardening his heart. Because of this, it's hard to say that the P or J text can be divided into coherent sources. But the unified text as it is has a coherent narrative. If narrative unity is our guide, there is no reason to divide the account of the plagues up between different sources. It flows smoothly without any intolerable contradictions. Moreover, Gary Rensburg argues the Exodus narrative contains many internal clues that show us it's a unified text, rather than being different sources stitched together. First, the plagues are divided into different pairs and triads to form patterns. The first 2 plagues are connected to the Nile, the next 2 are insects, the next pair is disease. The 4th pair is a combination of 2 calamities that come from the sky, hail and swarming locusts, and the final 2 plagues are connected with darkness. Rensburg says, if the arrangement of the plagues were due to the haphazard compilation of 3 different sources, one would not expect this pattern to obtain. The first 9 plagues can also be divided into 3 triads, with the 10th plague being a climactic event. In the first member of each triad, Moses is to position himself before Pharaoh in the morning to give him a warning. In the second member, a general warning is given without a reference to a time or positioning. And in the third member, no warning is given. Moshe Greenberg adds, the first triplet establishes God as a power beyond and other than the magic of Egypt. The second shows his presence in the land through a discriminating application of punishment. And the third gives scope to his power, more than anything that history has to tell. Additionally, Scott Nagel notes, the 7th plague, like the 10th, was intended to stand out in the narrative, that is, above the other 8. In biblical texts, where lists of 10 occur, a special significance is given to the 7th and 10th thing listed. We see this in places like Genesis 5, where Enoch and Noah stand out. In the genealogy of Ruth 4, special attention is given to the 7th, Boaz, and the 10th, David. Likewise, in the narrative of the plagues, special attention is given to the 10th plague, the climactic event, but also the 7th plague of hail. It contains the most verses of its description over any other plague, minus the 10th. It contains the longest uninterrupted divine monologue, a total of 7 verses. Moses restates God's threat. I will send all my plagues on you yourself. And because of this plague, the Pharaoh repents of his deeds and says he has sinned. We are also told here, the plagues were sent so that God could show his power over all the earth. Greta Hort noted we are given a threefold range of the destruction. The hail fell on Egypt, not the land of Goshen, and upon those in Egypt who did not regard the words of the Lord. And not only is Pharaoh's heart hardened here, but also his servants as well. Nagel says, such an interpretation demonstrates once more how a holistic approach bears out the unity of the narrative. Regardless of what sources may underlie the account in the book of Exodus, the finished product reflects an essential coherence with the inclusion of a deliberate rhetorical device, namely the double climax, organized in accordance with the 710 literary convention. It is unlikely such a literary convention would have come about by accident if the narrative is different sources stitched together by a redactor. It seems more likely the account was written as it is. Gary Rensburg says, would it not be easier simply to speak of the grand narrative as the product of a single author with planned literary design? Why go to the trouble to subdivide the narrative into theoretical component parts? The Exodus narrative, after all, is an actual literary artifice. The hypothesized sources are only that, hypothetical, with no proven reality. Furthermore, Umberto Cassuto noted deliberate use of the number 7 throughout the plague's narrative. After the Nile becomes blood, the author tells us 7 days passed. In the Hebrew, the word Nile occurs 14 times, between Exodus 7:14 and 29. The word flies occurs 7 times in the recounting of the 4th plague. When the 7th plague is being carried out, the word for land appears 7 times, with the 7th mention occurring alongside Goshen. The word field also occurs 7 times, and the word for hail occurs 14 times. Cassuto adds, the tendency towards numerical patterns, based on the number 7 and on the sexagesimal system, is observable throughout the section. In the first cycle, the names of the plagues occurs 21 times, 3 times 7, blood 5 times, frogs 11, gnats 5, and with the paragraph pertaining to the crocodile, 3 times, 24 twice times 12. In the second cycle, 12 times, swarms of flies 7, pests 1, boils 4. In the third cycle, 24, hail 14, locust 7, darkness 3, in all 60 times. All this can hardly be fortuitous. Furthermore, Rensburg notes before the plague's narrative, there are lexical parallels between the opening chapters of Genesis and the opening chapters of Exodus. Exodus 1 and 2 use many of the same verbs we see in Genesis 1, as well as using the same word for ark when Moses is placed in a basket in the Nile. These lexical interconnections at the beginning of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus signify a conscious effort to unite the first 2 books of the Torah. The nexus created, however, does not constitute a simple game of words, but rather yields a major theological point. The text wishes us to know that the 2 greatest acts performed by God were the creation of the world and the creation of the people of Israel, and such is accomplished via the use of shared vocabulary. Some have argued the verbs change throughout the text, which indicates different sources. But when the sources are broken up, the different verbs do not align with the divided sources perfectly. Friedman responds to this by noting a redactor likely modified the text. But Rensburg says, with all due respect to an important contributor to biblical studies, the only words that come to mind are too clever by half. To my mind, none of these machinations is necessary, especially once we recognize the employment of the admittedly under-recognized literary device of repetition with variation. He notes throughout biblical literature, ancient Israelite authors went to great lengths to vary their language whenever possible, especially if there was repetition in the text. The variation is not necessarily an indication of different sources, but is an Israelite literary device. Aaron Mirsky even demonstrated, in a list of similar or parallel expressions, ancient Hebrew demanded change for variation at the end. Some suggest a change in terms used for serpent between Exodus 4 and 7 suggests different sources. But Rensburg argues the change is expected due to changes in location. The word tannin is more appropriate to use at Pharaoh's palace, given that they are on the banks of the Nile, and it's the same word used for crocodile. Moreover, it demonstrates escalation, which we see throughout the narrative of miracles becoming more grand and more devastating. The escalation from snake to crocodile between chapters 4 and 7 is simply one more manifestation of this universal technique. It has not to do with separate sources. Some have suggested there is repetition in the text, which suggests different sources. Exodus 7:20 says, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded, implying the action was complete. But then the verse adds, in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile turned into blood. This might suggest the action was carried out twice. But Robert B. Chisholm Jr. notes, often in Hebrew there is a pattern of a summary statement followed by it being fleshed out in detail. In Ruth 1 it states that Naomi arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab. But then this event is fleshed out in more details in the following verses. The same pattern is observed in the plagues narrative. So this is not necessarily a repetition, but a common Hebrew style of giving a summary, followed by the details fleshed out. Moreover, he notes Exodus 7:17-21 is often divided between P and non-P, but the passage is paneled with verbal links, suggesting it was written by a single author, rather than being 2 or 3 sources stitched together. When we look at the data, it seems far more likely the plagues narrative has an intrinsic unity that cannot be divided between 2 or 3 sources. Therefore, this section of the Pentateuch doesn't support the documentary hypothesis. It instead better fits with the idea that much of the Pentateuch was written as a unified text that was updated and supplemented over time.